Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Jack Rayner. I'm one of your stage captains for the day here at the Book Festival. I have a few brief announcements before the program begins. Our author will be signing her book after the presentation. Volunteers will direct you how to get out from the doors you came in, and the signing tent is to the left. There will be no questions and answers for this presentation in order to give us a bit more time for conversation. Books are available for purchase. Eagle Eye is outside. They want to hear from you. Go and buy their books. The Decatur Book Festival is a nonprofit. It depends on sponsors and donations to bring great authors to Decatur every year. If you will, consider a deductible donation to support the festival by going to the festival website. It is decaturbookfestival.com. Now, if you will do the honors, please, and make sure that all of your devices are turned off and are quiet. And let me introduce Rosemary Magee, who is our moderator from Emory University, and then our author who is going to speak on a meditation on writing, Natasha Trethewey. We're glad you're here.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Excellent. Hello, Decatur Book Festival. This is so great to see everyone here, and it's a beautiful day, and to welcome back here to Decatur our own Natasha Trethewey. Natasha thinks that she's escaped from us, but we keep reeling her back in, and we hope, Natasha, that you consider us your home as well. We're here to discuss today this beautiful book, recently published for sale outdoors, Natasha Trethewey, The House of Being. And so this speaks to kind of a sacred moment, a sacred place, and sacred memories in Natasha's life and work. And we're going to begin with a brief reading by Natasha from this book, and then we'll proceed with conversation about it.
So before I begin, may I just say how delighted I am to be back here with all of y'all and to acknowledge my genius friend in the audience, Jericho Brown, on his MacArthur Fellowship. I'm going to read now from the very short opening to the book. The World Book. The first collection of books I ever encountered filled the shelves of the tall bookcase at the back of my grandmother's house. It stood just inside the doorway to the den at the end of a long hallway. From floor to ceiling was an assortment of novels and plays, history, philosophy, and mythology from my parents' university years, a set of classic children's stories in several volumes, etiquette books, a group of pamphlets from the 50s about the proper dress and comportment of young ladies, an abridged dictionary, and the 20-volume World Book Encyclopedia, 1966. Bought for the year I was born, the set was meant to be commemorative, marking the beginning of my journey toward knowledge. My grandmother had purchased the set after nearly a year of saving the S&H green stamp she received with each purchase at the grocery store. There had been other gifts to choose from, I was told, including bronzed baby shoes or a set of creamy white dishes embellished with a border of pink roses and leaves. But my mother had insisted on the encyclopedia. Pristine and stiff-spined, the set occupied an entire shelf of the bookcase. As soon as I was able to reach the volumes, I pulled one down to look at the photographs inside, the pages crisp and glossy. That the story of the World Book's provenance was passed down to me from the beginning made it even more prized. I was enthralled with the title, the idea that a set of books could contain even a single year of the world beyond our house. The thought of what awaited me there ignited a longing that followed me, even into sleep, as I listened to my father's voice reciting a bedtime story, the myth of Odysseus and his many trials that I was certain my father had found among the pages in the many books on those shelves. Our nightly ritual of stories from classical mythology was only part of the means by which my father meant to reveal the world to me. To prepare me for it and for the inevitable trials to come, he was determined that I have an early understanding of the metaphorical nature of language. During the day, the natural world served as our classroom. Most afternoons, we took long walks during which I'd pick wildflowers for my mother, and he would recite poetry. All along the way, he'd point out the flora and fauna we encountered, the vivid imagery inscribed in so many of the names: red-winged blackbird with its bright slash of feathers, mockingbird mimicking another bird's song, the word daisy, which he repeated again and again, altering it just so until I heard in the syllables of that single word two distinct ones: days-I. He had been holding the flower aloft, and suddenly I could see the way it mimicked the sun, each white petal a ray of light, the yellow disk at its center, our day's bright eye. On those afternoons, long before I could read, I heard Yeats's Sailing to Byzantium, Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays, Wordsworth's lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, even the epic poem Beowulf, first in Old English, then in translation, all in the cadences of my father's resonant voice. And though I could not always grasp at first their meanings, I trembled with excitement at the sounds. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress. Occasionally, my father would pause to explain a word, an image, the metaphor therein. Most often it was something he could illustrate with the things around us. On the roadside, evidence of its difficult crossing, the cracked shell on an old turtle, its tattered mortal dress. I carry with me still a dream of that time, the earliest I can remember from my childhood. I am standing in the hall outside the room I share with my parents, my crib beneath the window next to their bed. It is night, and the house is so quiet it seems that I am alone, or that everyone else is sleeping. The long hallway before me is a cave, tunneling through the darkness, the bookcase, I can just make it out, at its opposite end. And there, standing in the doorway, blocking it, is a figure the shape of a man, made entirely of the crushed oyster shells, white and sharp-edged, that form the driveway beside our house. It's a familiar scene, archetypal in its imagery, which is why I think it has stayed with me. I must have been only 3 years old when I had the dream, and so the contents of all those books were as yet unavailable to me. What had the dream meant back then? It's a question I've been trying to answer ever since. Because the imagery of dreams is figurative, metaphorical as all language is, it's easy to apply meaning over the course of one's life to make sense of not only the past, but also the present. I can't recall whether I had the dream on a night just after my father recited the story of Odysseus, the Cyclops, and the cave, but I can hear the echoes between them, how the hero of the story, on her quest, must get past the obstacle blocking her path to the world. When I think back on it now, I can see that all the stories my father told me, each with some form of the hero's journey, must have taken root in my psyche, establishing early on the pattern to which my own journey would conform. If the message I learned then from the experience of Odysseus was that it would take cleverness to outpace whatever obstacles stood before me, the meaning of the dream would deepen over the years as I came to see it as a metaphor rooted not only within the classical tradition of Greek mythology, but also in a vernacular tradition, the quest for knowledge, for literacy, enslaved narratives that was equated with personhood, citizenship, the ability to escape. That the obstacle in my dream was made of oyster shells, the indigenous materials of my native geography, is also telling. Location, wrote Eudora Welty, is the crossroads of circumstance. Even in the dream, I knew the World Book was there, waiting for me. I needed only to get to it.
That is such a beautiful rendering of your childhood, a place that's still obviously clearly in your thoughts. And this book, as I was reading it, really establishes a kind of meditative mood. And there are these very tangible aspects of things, the house, the oyster shells, the sewing machine of your grandmother's, and et cetera, the World Book. And then there's these very kind of almost philosophical meanderings, and especially around metaphor and crossroads, for instance. So this, an important aspect of this work, takes place in your grandmother's shotgun house in Gulfport, Mississippi, and of your many vast and specific memories there. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about what that place means to you, and also about the very vibrant presence that I felt of your grandmother as I read this book.
Yes. The first time I had to do a meditation on writing, on why I write, I think must have been back in 2008 or 9 here at Emory. I gave a lecture called Why I Write, Poetry, History, and Social Justice. By the time I wrote Memorial Drive, which is very much about my mother and her influence on my life, both before and after her death, it was also a meditation on why I write. And so when Yale asked me to write into this series, which is, they always ask writers to address one topic, why I write, I had already done it so many times. I thought, how can I do it again and say something different? Because the obsessions have not changed for me. The reasons that I write, which are always rooted in two existential wounds. One, sort of the wounds of history for me. As W.H. Auden wrote in his memoriam to William Butler Yeats, Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. My mad Mississippi, my native land, my United States with its original sin of white supremacy inflicted my first wound. And my deeper wound came later when I was 19 and my mother was killed. So that's always there as sort of the reason that I write. So what I decided I needed to do was to go back to the place where those early attitudes that one begins to form about the world happens, that formative place at a crossroads at my grandmother's house. My grandmother, and this was in a way sort of going back to my very first book, Domestic Work, because I started writing about my grandmother in that place, when I was first becoming a poet. Her house was located in my lifetime at the corner, at a crossroads. It was the corner of Jefferson Street, named after the president, Thomas Jefferson, and Highway 49, which is a legendary highway of the blues. At another intersection, supposedly Robert Johnson was supposed to have sold his soul to the devil. But she was at this crossroads that sort of represented something about the vernacular tradition of the blues and the sort of classical Enlightenment tradition of Thomas Jefferson. It was also a crossroads in American history when I was born. I was born in 1966, just after the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of 64 and 65. My parents' interracial marriage was still illegal at the time. So there's all these ways that that crossroads was there. And it seemed to me a perfect metaphor for the reasons that I had to become a writer, the things that I had to push back against, the received knowledge of Jefferson, that I would later begin to encounter in very troubling ways in the books that I loved.
Yes, I think that both historic and personal juncture in that place, at that crossroads, really permeates this book. And you were reading about the World Book, and I remember too going through my parents' World Book encyclopedia, which had actually been through a flood and had really bent pages and such, but and just randomly reading pages and learning things and looking at pictures and trying to understand myself and the world in the World Book. But you both find things there in the yearbook that are fascinating and that draw your attention. But steadily over time, you begin to realize there's a larger world beyond the coziness of this house and things that turns out aren't included in the World Book.
Right. Well, obviously, growing up in the landscape of the Deep South, it is a landscape, as you all know, inscribed with the Confederacy. I've often said if someone came from another planet and only visited the South, you'd think that the South had won the war. And it creates a kind of psychological exile, this feeling of being reminded constantly by the flag that's flying, the monuments that are erected, the roads that are named, the public works that are named after these Confederate heroes whose mission was to destroy the Union in the service of maintaining slavery and white supremacy. And so that is the narrative that one encounters, beyond the world of, your grandmother's house when you go around the South. What I was also realizing is that, because one summer I wanted to teach myself the Greek alphabet. I mean, these were the kinds of things that I could find in the World Book, and it was thrilling. And yet one day in the World Book, I found this section on races of man. And that is when I first began to see, even as the language was more moderate in what it was saying, the images themselves presented a hierarchy of race and difference. One example is the way that they divided the categories and they had images to go with it: Caucasoid, Negroid, Mongoloid. The Caucasoid representation was the bust of a statue carved in white Parian marble, looking off as if pensive and deep in thought, intellectual, philosophical. The representation of the Negroid type might as well have been a specimen or something not unlike Agassi's photographs of slaves in South Carolina, where, the person is rendered nothing more than this sort of specimen-like type with piercing eyes hiding so much of what was behind that. So even if the words didn't quite say that, the positioning on the page was always a hierarchy. And that was, I think, when I was beginning to see that these books that I had loved so much also were telling me things that were problematic, that were trying to tell me what they thought my position in the world was and should be, just like the exterior with all of those monuments. And something that's connected to that is the title of this book. I mean, the title is trying to do some work about the house of being as my grandmother's house, that this is the house where I come into being the person that I'm going to be. This is the place that I first arrived at the day after my birth on Confederate Memorial Day. It is where it always begins. But the house of being, that phrase comes from the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, and this is something my father would say to me all the time. Language is the house of being. And it's a beautiful sentiment, because we do enter the world through language, through beginning to name things outside of ourselves, even as we're also beginning to learn to name ourselves. And either we accept the naming that the language is giving us, or we push back against it. The problem with that beautiful phrase is that Martin Heidegger was also a Nazi. And and it was troubling to me to think that I would take this quote from a Nazi and put it on the cover of my book, because I thought there are going to be people who read this and say, wait a minute, are you not critical about that and where this comes from? So that story I was telling you about, like seeing the World Book Encyclopedia and believing in the sanctity of books, believing that books were repositories for the most important ideas across time and space, was complicated, because we know that they're also repositories for some of the worst ideas. And that's also manifest in, arguments I had with my father about the Enlightenment. Which is, the Enlightenment is great. It gave us so much, and yet it also was when philosophers first started to codify ideas of racial difference and hierarchy. Or Thomas Jefferson, who in Notes on the State of Virginia had a lot of things to say about black people, including, among blacks there is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. That's something I had to push back against.
Well, you certainly have pushed back against that. And we're so grateful for that. Gosh, I lost my train of thought.
I talked a long time.
No, but I was really in the moment with you on all of that. And one of the things about reading the World Book or reading Thomas Jefferson or reading textbooks is that they sound so authoritative.
Yes.
They sound objective. It's not like, well, this is my point of view or this is based on my limited knowledge, but this is the way it is.
Yeah.
But kind of through your excavation of history writ large and your own personal history, you discover that there's more to it than meets the eye. And I now more fully understand how all of that house of being, you're becoming your own being in your grandmother's house. And I want you to talk a little bit about, I mentioned this to you earlier, in the book, you referenced, your grandmother was really an entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. She had many different occupations, and eventually she became a drapery seamstress.
That's right.
In her home, mm-hmm. in this home. And there was a whole room devoted to this, and these Singer sewing machines, 3 Singer sewing machines. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm talking about, the very specific aspects of this that take you in. And you would often visit her in the sewing room, but you also had your own playroom next mm-hmm. door. And the cadence of listening to her work and sewing, how that transformed itself into a kind of poetry for you. You also had your father's influence, your mother's abiding presence, but how that listening to your grandmother informs your idea of poetry.
Yes, in my room right next to hers, being able to hear her sewing, and she had this, giant cutting table that took up most of the room, and she was very precise about measuring mm-hmm. and cutting. She was very precise about the way that you had to make patterns fit together on pattern fabric. You could tell if clothing was good if the patterns, if they were matching one part of a flower to another flower at a seam, if it was off, that was a lack of precision that said something about the quality of, the garment. Also, she's working this pedal, the whole time and pushing the fabric through there. And I can hear when it's, going a certain way and she's speeding up sometimes, and then she slows down when it gets more difficult, and I can hear her make the turn, And all of that, it says to me, something about, the nature of syntax. And how what we say is not divorced from how it is said and how it is made. And I include in here a poem in its entirety of I want to find the page so I can quote it. My grandmother, as I look for it, let me tell you this story. My grandmother, as you said, her final sort of entrepreneurial thing was to be a drapery seamstress, self-employed out of her home. And people came to her workroom all the time. And one year, after a hurricane, I can't remember which one, but my grandmother, I was visiting her. We were sitting in her living room. Oh, this was not after the hurricane, but this was after Senator Trent Lott said several years ago, some of you probably remember, that things would have been a lot different and better had Strom Thurmond been our president. And you just let that sink in. But so my grandmother and I are sitting there watching it, and Trent Lott's a little bit on the hot seat, not as much as he should have been for having said that. And my grandmother just looked at him and she said, I made his draperies. But when I think about my grandmother and the work that she did, I always think about this poem by Lucille Clifton called Study the Masters. Like my Aunt Timmy, it was her iron, or one like hers, that smoothed the sheets the master poet slept on. Home or hotel, what matters is he lay himself down on her handiwork and dreamed. She dreamed too. Words, some Cherokee, some Maasai, and some huge and particular as hope. If you had heard her chanting as she ironed, you would understand form and line and discipline and order and America.
Yeah.
Lucille Clifton.
Just a plug for Emory Rose Library, commercial break here. But we have both the papers of Natasha Trethewey as well as those of Lucille Clifton, among many other great writers and artists. You referenced the hurricane. You mentioned it in passing. So there was a monstrous hurricane that influenced your early life in Gulfport, Camille.
That's right.
And then, of course, you were very influenced by the Hurricane Katrina. And as we're sitting here, there are writers who are going to be missing today because they weren't able to come from Western North Carolina and Appalachia. And I'm wondering if what's happening now in the aftermath of that, which has been compared to Katrina, has how you're reading that, how you're feeling that, how that enters your consciousness in the ways that you also experience these other great land and water events.
Yeah, well, it is stunning, the devastation
Yes.
that's happened in North Carolina. And what it makes me think about is just what a sort of demarcation in the lives of people, as traumas always are. When I was growing up, because I was 3 when Hurricane Camille hit, on the Gulf Coast, Mississippi Gulf Coast, we tended to mark time as either BC or AC, before
Yes.
Camille, after Camille. And then Katrina came along, and people had to think about the period between those two. And I'm just thinking about now how many, especially the impact on children as well, because my niece was, very small during Katrina, and I'm thinking about that trauma as a demarcation in people's lives.
Right. And it certainly has been for you. And we know it is for so many other people. In addition to the World Book being the kind of introductory section of this book, there are 5 sections altogether, one of which is Crossroads, what you call Crossroads. Although 4. Are there 4?
4 sections,
Okay, okay, I miscounted. There are 4 sections, you're right. And in all of these metaphors, though, go throughout. World Book is both in that first section, it goes throughout just as Crossroads is mentioned in that. And to me, there is a dream-like quality to this book, where there are dreams featured in it. You also reference yourself as a child, as a dreamy child. And it's almost like the past, the present, and the future, and dreams and what we call reality sort of blend into one another. They're blurred edges to it. And I wonder do you almost induce a dreamlike state when you write something like this that has that quality to it?
Well, I think I try to, especially with the 2 dreams that I reference in this book, to try to enter them again in recollection, obviously, even, and the way that, things sort of shift in meaning, which is, why I said we can apply different meanings to the dreams over the course of our lives. So that first dream, I've thought about that dream, my whole life, because at each stage of my life, I make a different sense of it. So that image, for example, that I liken to the very archetypal image of, in the story of the Cyclops and Odysseus, trying to be clever enough to get past, because the Cyclops has rolled a boulder there. And so, Odysseus and his men can't get out, and the Cyclops is, so this is the barrier he's got to get past. And, we know that, how he figures out to do it. They tie themselves to the belly of the sheep, and they go past the Cyclops. So there's that cave, and and the light is outside there, which is sort of what I'm thinking of as where, the World Book and knowledge and all the possibilities of that are there if I can get to it. So why is it that there is a figure the shape of a man blocking it, made out of my native geography, made out of those shells? Who is the man blocking it? Over the course of my life, I can think about that different ways, because in some ways, at some point, the person I had to even push back against in terms of received knowledge was my own father, my white parent. Another part of my life, you may think, even though during the part of the dream, I did not know the person who would become my stepfather for 10 difficult years, and yet he became a barrier to what I could achieve and become. The dream on the backside of the book is one that I only acknowledge for the first time in this book, and I think this goes back to the idea of the house of being. My grandmother's house is the place that it seems to me that I should feel my safest, because it is the place of my early happy memories. My parents were still together. There was the world of books. But we know that the world of books was already bringing in something of the world outside. And maybe that's the reason. But in this dream, it starts with me sort of feeling happy because I'm back in my grandmother's house. And I'm alone, but somehow I'm still happy to be in this place. And then I start walking around the rooms, and I realize that none of the doors will lock, that none of the windows will lock. And try as I might, I can't get them to fasten. I can't close out whatever awaits outside of that. And that's the idea of it, that even in that safest place, something else enters. And what I realize in the dream is that only my own vigilance is going to keep whatever is out there at bay.
Well, that is a very powerful dream and very, it's emotional for all of us hearing it, as well as you sharing it with us. Let me just give you a moment here. You need a Kleenex?
Yeah, I think I might have.
Anybody have a Kleenex? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That's a poetry Kleenex. That's from a fellow poet.
I should have had my black lace handkerchief that I have one in there, because, my grandmother would, taught me to, but I should have had it in my hand so that I didn't have to go reaching for it, so thank you.
That's okay. We all needed a moment to, going back to that house for just a minute, that photograph of you and your mother and your father, which is a very endearing photograph within the book. I mean, that's one of the things I like about the book, even though it's very brief. It has these, just a selection of photographs that help us understand the story, and it's you and your mother and father, and they have different gestures or different ways that they're touching you and you in between them. And and that's right, that's the era before their divorce. Yeah. So you are all together. You also write in a poem that you quote here, a permanence. And that's about objects, memories, and history, and you ponder what would keep us from being erased and being forgotten. And I feel like the book is an effort to try to understand that. And you're both a historian and a detective and a poet as you go about this, and I wonder what that process is like for you. Is it going through the actual photographs, reading the poems, reflecting on the memories, to draw up these things that are hidden both in our personal lives and then in the larger world?
Yeah, so you're talking about an unfinished poem, a poem that I could never finish, and I think and I talk about it in the book, that I think I couldn't finish it because I wasn't asking the right question, the deeper question. The question that I was asking was this question about, on one level, the nature of permanence and inscription in a historical sense. My grandmother's house was up on cinder blocks, so you could see, straight, because of flooding, so you could see straight underneath it, which always struck me as a house with no sort of concrete foundation that was really tying it to the land. And so it always made me feel that at any moment we could be swept away. And I remember this moment
you could
after.
Be.
Yeah. Well, of course, literally. Yeah. I remember a moment after, a severely heavy rain, opening the back door, and where there were 3 steps of a stoop, the water came right up to the back porch. And that's when I thought, we could just be erased. And in a landscape, again, that is inscribed with one narrative, this narrative of the Confederacy, how do we inscribe our own narrative so as not to be erased? And this is the thing that I kept thinking about. Later on, it would sort of, the way our metaphors, as Mark Doty says, go on ahead of us, it would reveal to me that what I was really asking at that point, and this is before I began to write about my mother, about having lost her, that the question I needed to be asking was about what is going to keep her from being erased and forgotten. And I think, if some of you have heard me talk about this, you might know that I hadn't had not put a monument, and I'm very concerned with monuments, and I had not erected one, nothing with her name in stone on a piece of ground, you know. And so it took a long time for me to see other ways to inscribe that monument, something that might actually last even longer than a piece of stone that I might put her name on.
So, do you think of yourself as a kind of historian?
You know, one of the other reasons that I write is not unlike, you know, Robert Hayden, who said that he wanted to write in order to correct some of the misapprehensions of African American history, to set the record straight. And I think that that is the case. I mean, growing up, again, I've been mentioning monuments and all the other ways that things are inscribed, but let me just add the inscription of our textbooks, you know? Growing up with textbooks that were, again, you know, telling me about, you know, our role as African Americans in the building of this country, which, based on the books I read, was nothing. You know, the historian Eric Foner has pointed out that of the monuments, you know, hundreds of monuments north and south, only a handful even mention the participation of African Americans in the Civil War. So it's no wonder that so many Americans have no idea that nearly 200,000 African Americans fought in the Civil War to, you know, help us realize our highest ideals. And so it is those kinds of things that I feel, again, pushing back against the received knowledge, that if I'm trying to do work as a poet historian, it is to reinscribe narratives that have been erased or have not been properly inscribed.
I mean, I feel that I learn not only about your own personal journey and personal travails and your, you know, incredible response to all of that, beautiful response and transformation of it, but also about the larger history that we've all been, that's been kept from us. So at the end of your book, you compare the house at Jefferson and 49 to the architecture of thought. It is this shotgun house, one room after another, one room leads to the next. And I'm just wondering, as I'm sure other members of the audience are wondering, do you know where your creative process will take you next?
Well, it always seems to go back to Mississippi. You know, Mississippi is a place that one can't really escape, you know? And so I'm still thinking about new ways that Mississippi tells us about who we are as Americans. There's a lovely line in a poem by Elizabeth Sewell. It's a poem called They Were the Lands, the land was theirs before they were the lands, or I'm saying that wrong. She's quoting The Gift outright, you know, Robert Frost's poem, but it's a poem about Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, and their bodies being found in that berm in Mississippi. And this is a book that, you know, that came out in 1963. But what she says is, we are all Mississippians. If you want to know the state of the nation, if you want to know who we are as a people, just look to the microcosm of Mississippi. That's sobering, I know.
Yes.
But it's not all bad, because there are people trying to do the good work in Mississippi to get us to reckon with our history, the facts of it, the truth of it, not the whitewashed, erased version of it.
And that reckoning is what your work is so much about. As well, we know from Mississippi that they're really important, significant, and meaningful writers poets, novelists who have sprung from there. And we're so grateful to have you here in Georgia, where we're also struggling, but we believe we'll be moving
Don't people
forward.
in Georgia probably say, thank God for Mississippi? Doesn't everybody? I'm not trying to beat you at the race to the bottom, because I love Mississippi. It's the place that made me.
Yes.
But to love a place is really to critique it hard.
Well, we are so grateful for your voice, your presence, your being with us, and I hope you will always consider us as one of your homes. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you.
all of you. Thank you.
The bookstore is out here. The signing tent is to your left. Thank you.